Perfect. All right, well, good morning, CREWBaltimore, and welcome to our Tuesday morning virtual Conversations Over Coffee. For those of you that don't know, my name is Kristen Schrader. I'm the Commercial Business Development Manager with Harkins Builders. We're a general contractor out of Columbia, Maryland, and I'm also your CREW Board President. Excited to have all of you back. I see some new faces, which is exciting. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors, our annual sponsors, gold sponsors, Harkins Builders, JLL, and Miles and Stockbridge. Silver sponsors, Absolute Service Industries, Kuhn Resnick, Kopt, Crammon and Graham, Budova Engineering, Rosenberg, Martin and Greenberg, the Brick Companies, and the Rockefeller Group. Our bronze sponsors, All Safe Elevator Inspections, Sonero, Charm City Concierge, Gradeline Construction Company, Howard Bank, Infinity Environmental, Katz Abosch, Land Care, Merit Companies, Mona Electric Group, My Cleaning Service, Omega Fire and Life Safety, and the Bailey Architects, Price Modern, Rupert Landscape, Tyson Krupp Elevator, Unlimited Restoration, VSC Fire and Security, and Wyford Taylor and Preston. So today's webinar is on HVAC. We're probably going to talk about a little bit of re-entry and just general systems in existing buildings and new construction. This will be recorded and put up on our YouTube page for people to watch later. If you want, most of you have already done so, but you can get your name and put your company name next to your Zoom name on the screen, so people know who you are. And if you have questions, we're going to utilize the chat feature, and I'll tell you if there are technical questions, like long technical questions, I'm just going to unmute you and have you ask the panelists. Today's moderator is Kat Sabo, President of Budova Engineering, Mike Sabo, Principal at Budova Engineering, and Brendon Burley, Project Manager and Senior Mechanical Engineer and Healthcare Practice Leader at BKM Engineering. We're going to put everybody on mute except for our panelists, and Kat, I'll let you take it away. Feel free to introduce yourself further and explain what you do and what your companies do.
Thanks, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's good to see you. I hope you are staying safe and feeling good. I would say I hope you're staying sane, but we're in week 9, so I know that's probably too much to ask, especially those of you with kids. Congratulations on making it through another day. So I want to reiterate what Kristen said. Thank you to our sponsors. We appreciate your support. Thank you to Kristen's support and leadership during this time. To Kelsey from Charm City Concierge for all the behind the scenes stuff. And of course to you members for being here today and for giving us great ideas for events like this. So I am the president of Budova Engineering. We are a small engineering consulting firm. We started in Atlanta, Georgia 8.5 years ago, and we relocated to this area 6 years ago, next month. We are primarily a commissioning firm, and we also do energy modeling and energy audits, things like that. You're going to hear from one of our principals today, who happens to be my husband. Let's just get that out there if you didn't already do the math. And then also Brendon Burley from BKM. So I just want to give you a little bit more about the speakers, get to know them a little bit more professionally and personally, and then we'll dig right into the meat of the presentation. So Brendon, as Kristen said, is a project manager, senior mechanical engineer at BKM. He is known for designing healthcare and higher education facilities, has been doing that for the past 10 years. As a project engineer for the mechanical design, and also as the project manager responsible for the successful execution of those projects across the MEP and fire protection trades. Brendon lives in Westminster with his wife and 4 children, so he gets extra credit for being here today. He enjoys great conversations about politics, science, and religion. He likes finding the local spots when he travels, and he admits to losing the battle with his lawn for control of his yard. Brendon is on the ASHRAE committee, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because much of what we're discussing today is coming from ASHRAE, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Mike is a principal at Budova Engineering. He has 25 years experience as a mechanical engineer. He, in the last 10 years, has focused on the role of a commissioning agent. He enjoys all Penn State sports, fishing, and coaching his kids' sports teams. And he lives in Arnold with his amazing wife and their 2 children. So we're happy to have you both here today. We appreciate your time and expertise. All right, so let's get to the presentation. In case you don't know, ASHRAE is the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, and they are really what is guiding all this information that you've either seen or will see, because as you probably know, this topic is really relevant right now. So we're going to start with Brendon. His company put out 6 different focus points, I guess, if you will, and we're going to have him break them down, talk about what they are, and tell us hopefully how they're going to help us as we move forward. Obviously, we understand that you're already going to be starting with Renee's company, Polly's company, Kathleen's company, in terms of doing the cleaning of the offices before reentry. But what everyone is realizing now is we need to go to the next level and look at the HVAC system. How are they going to change moving forward in terms of design? And how are the older systems already in place going to be retrofitted to help with the current condition as we move forward? So I saw a quote in an article I read from the Washington Business Journal that a principal of an engineering firm said, you can't filter the bad people out, you have to filter out the air. And I thought, ooh, that's a dangerous quote. That could be so taken out of context, but he was referring to COVID-19 and how you can't tell who's going to be in those buildings. So you really have to work the systems to make sure they're getting the bad stuff out. All right, so Brendon, let's start with you. One of the first things BKM said was increasing outdoor air ventilation. So please explain that, talk to us about what that means.
Thank you, Kat. Good morning, everyone. So when we talk about increasing outdoor air ventilation, and I should preface all this saying that these recommendations are a sampling of the recommendations found in the recently released ASHRAE position document on infectious aerosols. So they're not coming out of left field. They're the consensus of over 2 years of study by members of the Environmental Health Committee at ASHRAE. And they are comprised of building owners, building designers, and infection control specialists from healthcare and laboratory facilities across the country that have come together to make these recommendations. So getting back to the topic of increased outdoor air ventilation, the premise of all ventilation in buildings is dilution. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to remove contaminants from the air. And the best way to remove contaminants from an active environment is to constantly bring in clean air and wash out the dirty air as you do so. So you replace dirty air with clean air. So the more you can do to increase your ventilation, the lower concentration of contaminants, which includes potentially infectious agents in the air, which means a decreased likelihood in you receiving an infectious dose if you're in the environment.
Great, okay. Are there any concerns about that? Like, is there anything that could trip people up, or is it as simple as increase outdoor air ventilation?
Well, there's lots of things that can trip you up when it comes to increasing outdoor air ventilation. I believe that Mike can probably talk to us a little bit more about the limits of the type of equipment we typically see in commercial buildings, but any engineered system is designed to operate over a certain range, and that includes a percentage of outside air at a design condition. We also have control sequences in many buildings for economizer mode, which increases the amount of outside air when it's optimal for energy purposes, but doesn't necessarily do so when it's possible for ventilation purposes. So when we talk about increasing outside air, it could be as simple as simply opening up that unit to operate at its full potential, which you can figure out by talking with the manufacturers or with an engineer to work with you to figure out what the system's capable of. Or it could be as complex as broadening the spectrum of your control sequences so that they can actually accomplish a wider range of ventilation with the existing equipment. And that leads into another one of the points that we have in there, which is disabling the demand control ventilation sequences that many people have implemented for energy savings. because what they do is they reduce the amount of fresh air that's going into the space. By disabling them, you're not really stretching the limit of your equipment because it was already designed to operate as if there were people there. You're simply removing more contaminants from the air more frequently.
Right. Okay. All right. A second point was improve central air and other HVAC filtration to MERV 13. MERV is minimum efficiency reporting value, and most filters are an 8. Brendon, is that correct?
That's correct. The typical commercial filter is a MERV 8 filter. Occasionally you'll see some legacy MERV 6 systems, but if you're following ASHRAE standards, you should have at least a MERV 8 in your typical unit.
Okay, and now the recommendation is bump that up to 13.
Yes, and the basis of that recommendation has less to do with the actual ability of the MERV 13 filter to remove a virus, because you have to understand that viruses are very small, typically on an order of 0.1 or smaller microns to 0.4 microns. And a typical filter is going to be good to somewhere between 1 and 3 microns. You can get a high efficiency filter, which is good down to 0.3 microns. That's a HEPA filter. Now that doesn't mean that it's ineffective below that. It still removes a large portion of smaller particles, but you do get what's called breakthrough or penetration. So you will have a lot of these particles move through even a high efficiency filter and wind up in the airstream. And studies by the Defense Department have shown that in large enough quantities of dose, it is possible to still have an infectious dose even after high efficiency filtration. So why MERV 13 filters? Well, it really comes down to the size of the filters. So a MERV 13 filter is available in a 2-inch pleated style. And most filter frames for commercial equipment are 2-inch frames. So MERV 13 is the highest efficiency frame that you can fit, or highest efficiency filter you can fit in a standard frame without modifying your unit. And the reason why we still recommend this, even though viruses will still penetrate, is because most viruses don't travel alone. They're going to be part of what's called a nuclei. And the nuclei exists when you aerosolize. So when you cough, sneeze, sweat, you actually release a bunch of droplets that include water, they include saliva, they include little pieces of your body that have shed off, and they include viruses. They also capture things that were moving into your system, like dust, pollen, and all that comes together in a clump. And then when the water evaporates, you're left with a nuclei. Now, if the nuclei is big, it typically settles out on the surface. If it's small, though, it can stay in the air, and that's how you get airborne spread of diseases. Whereas if it's large, it typically falls onto a surface. And that's why they say don't touch your face and be careful about the cleanliness of the surfaces, because when you look at the distribution of sizes, more than 50% of what you release as an aerosol is going to settle on a surface. It's not going to go into the air system. And the infectious load of that amount can be greater than 75% of the infectious load of the whole aerosol.
Okay. That, as Terry so eloquently put, is icky, but good to know. So I'm going to actually skip to 4, Brendon, because that's also talks about MERV filters and the HEPA filter that you talk about, and then we'll go back to 3. I hope that doesn't mess you up.
Doesn't bother me at all.
Okay, great. So go ahead and kind of explain that, and then your take on that, please.
So another recommendation that ASHRAE makes is to consider in-room HEPA filtration. And it's very important to understand that this is more of a measure of last resort. Ideally, we want to be able to clean the room out, the air out, by moving fresh air into the space. But if we can't do that, then we want to use in-room filtration. Now, it's very important to understand that, as we already mentioned, the virus can penetrate through even high efficiency filters, but you're going to remove a lot of it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to place these in such a way that you just reduce the overall bioload in the space, and thus you reduce the chances that you're going to get an infectious dose for any individual person. What's very important is, if you're going this route, is that you need to understand that this filter system is drawing air in and then blowing air out. when you duct this system, or when you have it just sitting in the room, where that air is blowing on you is going to be the highest concentration of dosage that you're going to get, other than the air in the environment itself, because it's fresh out of the filter, it's all concentrated and packed together, and it hasn't had time to spread out into the space. So you really do need to consider distribution when you put these systems in. And I know everyone's thinking, oh, I just want to run out to the Home Depot and get a couple of these because I probably have one in my garage for mold or allergies and whatnot. Fungal spores are 5 to 10 times larger than a virus, and HEPA is really good at stopping them. Viruses, not so much. Doesn't mean you can't use it, but you want to use it judiciously, and you want to use it in spaces where you really don't have a better means of cleaning the air. So spaces where you can't get an exhaust system in there, or your air handling units just cannot handle it, then you might want to consider these portable HEPA filters as a way to reduce your risk.
Okay, great, thank you. Now we're on 4, keeping the systems running longer 24/7 if possible. Talk to us about that.
And same principle as number 1. We want to make sure that we're cleaning the air as often as possible. So even when there aren't people in the building, there's still going to be resuspension. So remember, we talked about a lot of what you aerosolize settles on the surface. Some of it will kick back up. And one of the things that can kick it back up is cycling of an air handling system. And I know this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but if you think about it, you have a pretty steady current, particularly near diffusers or inlets, and it's going to rely on momentum to keep things trapped. If you turn off that air system, then anything that was suspended by the momentum of the air is going to fall out. When the air system kicks back on, it's now loose, and it's going to go in different directions. So this is a relatively small thing, but it can have a very large impact in the long term in terms of the quality of the air. So one of the things we can do is, by leaving these systems running longer, we can get the air to its cleanest point possible, which means that when resuspension does occur, you've already started out from a cleaner baseline. So there's less burden in the air.
Okay, great. All right, the next one is adding a duct or air handling unit mounted upper room or portable UVGI device. Can you explain what all that means? It's kind of a mouthful.
So UVGI is ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. And there's a wide range of expertise on this area. The reason why this is recommended by ASHRAE is it is one of the few proven air cleaning technologies out there. There's a rather famous study from the 1940s, I believe it was, where they were looking at a measles outbreak in Philadelphia. And they did a classroom where they suspended a UV light above the heads of the students, and they took another classroom where they did not suspend the light, and they found that the spread of measles within the classroom with the light was significantly reduced. Now, the way this works is that you are trying to expose the biologicals, and this works on things other than viruses. So bacteria are also affected, funguses are also affected, people are also affected if they get exposed to it. But certain frequencies will actually decompose DNA. And that's effectively what you're doing. You are destroying the reproductive capability of these devices, their ability to live effectively. If a person gets exposed to UV light, they tend to get sunburn, and you can even get sunburn on your eyes, which I imagine is very painful, as most people have not experienced that. UV comes in a variety of wavelengths in the spectrum. The most common ones in manufactured products are 185 nanometers and 254 nanometers. The peak germicidal efficiency is at 265 nanometers. So it's really not practical from a cost perspective to produce products that work at that wavelength. So most products are going to be at 254. And ASHRAE, in the most recent edition of Standard 62.1, banned the use of 185 nanometer frequencies inside air systems because it's the same excitation energy as the oxygen dimer, so it will break out into ionized particles and create ozone. So we now restrict that to only water systems. And the thing to understand about UVGI is that in addition to the wavelength, there's exposure time. So just because you go outside doesn't mean you get a sunburn. You have to stay there long enough. And the same thing is true with these systems, which is why part of this recommendation is you want ceiling fans or other systems that are going to encourage the flow of air up into the area where the UVGI system is. You also want to make sure that the airflows are slow enough or the extent of the lighting is long enough that you're able to get enough exposure so that you actually deactivate the biologicals. And those can be very difficult things, particularly when we're talking about inside and air handling unit. And although many of you may have a UVGI lighting on your cooling coil to keep down fungus and bacterial growth, it's not going to be enough to get rid of viruses on its own. That's a very different system. You need to speak with a lighting rep or a UV rep to help you figure out how many more lights you need to add if you need to extend the bay. But this is one of the few proven air cleaning technologies. That's not to say that other air cleaning technologies, such as bipolar ionization or PCO, would not be effective, but PCO is restricted in use of buildings because it relies specifically on producing ozone. Very effective at killing biologicals, but very dangerous to people as well. So it's out there, but you are not going to be allowed to use it. Bipolar ionization has the potential to produce ozone. The technology is not proven. They will make a lot of claims about cleaning the air, but their science is fuzzy, and there's really no body of evidence to suggest that it's effective against viruses. So that's more of a buyer beware situation. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that it can be very good about producing comfortable environments, reducing the complaints of VOCs, but there's not a lot of data to back it up, which is why ASHRAE did not include it in their recommendations.
Okay, great. All right, let's do our last one, and then we'll see if Kristen wants to put any of the questions in now before we switch over to Mike. So bypassing the energy recovery ventilation system.
Again, we're talking about getting more fresh air in there. Energy recovery ventilation systems, what we're really talking about here is wheels, because wheels have the potential to move air from the exhaust airstream into the fresh air airstream. Even if you have purge sections, those seals will deteriorate over time. If you have variable operation of the fans, the pressure differential across the wheel will change. And because the wheels are just sieves, you will have small particles that get trapped in the sieve and then rotate to the other side of the stream where they get dislodged into the other airstream. So the disabling these systems is really just a way of saying, okay, we're going to get the air cleaner by eliminating a potential source of contamination of the outside air and thus reduce the overall bioburden.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brendon.
Okay.
Kristen, you want to put any questions out there now, or do we want to?
No, I think we can go ahead and do that. Wendy Cassini had a question. What about the UV light air filtration? Is this being put into offices?
So I'm afraid I would need a little bit more clarification on that one. So are we talking about UV inside of air ducts or above ceiling?
It's actually, you can see it. They actually just put it in the office. They're doing that right now in Texas. So I was just wondering if your company has talked about that or knows anything about that. But you can visually see it as you walk in. They're literally just propping it in the office.
So I would be a little bit concerned about any UV light that you can see. Oftentimes, if it's upper room, you will notice there's this bug zapper. And some of you, if you have an older hospital, you've seen those on the wall. That's typically what one of these upper room UV devices is. There are some UV devices that they will put in rooms, and I believe they operate at a 400 nanometer, 405 nanometer wavelength. So there is a peak in germicidal effectiveness there, but it's markedly lower than both the 185 and the 254 that you more commonly see in air systems. So you're less likely as a human to be bothered by it, but it's also much less effective at getting rid of any other biological.
Okay. Okay.
Terry Harrington said there's a vent above my desk at the office. Should I have that shut down?
Is it a supply or is it a return? Do you do you feel the air blowing on you, or is it just collecting air from you?
I think she's saying blowing on her.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I had to find my unmute. Well, I am in the office. It blows on me generally. And I'm asking this because I think all of us are in little tiny, if we have an office, 8x10 offices with the air rushing at us. And does that give us a higher, are we more susceptible to having the viruses land on us if it's coming through that vent?
So that's an interesting question. And from the perspective of, if you assume the air coming out of that vent is clean, then you're in a protected situation because it's going to move virus away from you. Now, unfortunately, you're probably in a recirculating system. So if your colleagues are sick, well, then it's going to blow that air directly on you. But the question is it going to be any worse than anywhere else you're going to be moving in that office? Because once it goes through that system, it has been filtered to a degree. So it's still going to be cleaner than if you were sitting across the desk from that same person who potentially has the illness. So I would not recommend blocking that vent because you're getting more benefit from the fresh air that's being introduced into the system and from the fact that there is a filter there reducing the bioload in that air than you would be if you were in a place that had stagnant air. So you should not block your vent.
So and sorry to bombard you with questions, but can I assume that the ventilation flowing through my office in a multi-story office building is only coming from my office, or is it coming from everybody in the entire building?
It's coming from everybody in the entire building, but the way it's going to work is, let's take the hypothetical that your next door neighbors on the same system as you, they're sick. They have a big bioburden in their office because they're sick. They're shedding agents everywhere. Now that goes and gets collected up into the air handling system. If you have a 100% outside air system, that gets taken outside. So as long as you're not in their office, you're at low risk. If you don't have a 100% outside air system, then it's going to go back into the air handling system. Now it's going to mix with all the other clean spaces in the office first. So it's going to get diluted. Let's say there are 10 offices. So it's 10% of the concentration it would be if you were in their office. Then it gets filtered. And let's say that you only have a MERV 13 filter and that you're at best getting 50% effectiveness. Well, you're still 5% of what the burden would have been if you were in their office with them. So if you have any chance of meeting your colleague in the next office over and shaking their hands or bumping into them at the kitchenette, you're at much higher risk than you are going to be from anything that comes out of that air vent. It's not to say your risk is zero, but unless you have a 100% outside air system, it's going to be better than if you were in the environment with that person. Now let's take the scenario where you shut down that supply air instead. Now what happens is that you're in this office, any contaminants that you have are going to build up, your humidity is going to get higher, you're going to have a poor air quality issue, and then your friend comes in and decides to add their burden to the space, not knowing that they're sick, and that's just going to sit there. And it's going to settle on your surfaces, and you're probably more likely to pick it up than if your space was continually circulating and trying to remove anything that they happen to contribute when they pay a visit. So that's why, in a statistical sense, it is better to keep those systems running, even if they are recirculating. And that's why we say, put the filters in, even though they may not eliminate all the virus, it reduces the burden. And that's all we can do. We're playing a game of percentages because we really don't have good methods that can 100% eliminate the virus without extreme expense or extreme challenges. And Mike is going to talk about how these changes will have impacts to your energy usage, which is a very big challenge with all of these recommendations. It is a change in our paradigm of design from saving energy is paramount to well buildings being paramount. And there will be a new balance that needs to be found between those two positions.
That is great information. Thank you. Because as a broker, talking to tenants in buildings, that question comes up a lot. And I'm on a 28-story building and we're all sharing the same air.
Yeah, usually you'll have an air handler per floor, but you are sharing with your neighbors.
All right, I got to go give those guys the hairy eyeball.
Remember, you're putting yourself at higher risk by being in their presence than if you just share.
All I heard is I'm shutting my door and none of my colleagues are coming in. Thank you.
Perfect. I don't have any other questions, but I have a lot of requests for a fact sheet. So I'm sure that you've got something that you can brand with BKM and send.
Yeah, we can put something together. I'll talk to our marketing group. And
that would be really helpful. And I'm happy to disseminate it to all my landlords. And I'm sure other people can use that as well.
Perfect. That is all I've got right now. So Kat, go ahead.
Great. All right. So now we're going to shift a little bit and head over to Mike, who's going to crush all our dreams by telling us how difficult it's going to be to do all the things that Brendon is telling us to do. And I think the sad part is looking, like Brendon just mentioned, is how this really is going to affect the progress we've made in terms of sustainability and energy efficiency. A good analogy is, think going to the grocery store now. For how long have we worked to get the plastic bags out of the grocery stores and everyone bring in their own recyclable bag? And now you can't bring those in anymore. So you're going to see that similar trend, unfortunately, with the HVAC system. So Mike, go ahead and tell us what you can, I guess, about the challenges you see with these proposed solutions and how that's going to impact energy, please.
Okay. While Brendon was talking, I came up with something, and I didn't read it, but remember, or not remember, it's still the case. If somebody says, I want a new building, from a designer perspective, you have faster, I want it quicker, I want it cheaper, or I want it to be top quality, right? So I know the designers have heard this before. You get to pick two. So if you want your building faster and cheaper, you're sacrificing quality. If you want your building to be quality, but you want it quick, it's not going to be cheap. So that's a pretty standard pick two scenario that's been around for a long time. Well, just now I came up with a pick one scenario. Do you want your building safe? Do you want your building energy efficient? Or do you want the occupants to be completely comfortable? You get to pick one in the COVID-19 scenario. So,
Thanks.
I mean, it's unfortunate that if we're going towards the optimal safety, which I assume is the near-term direction, and everything's going to in the design world is going to kind of undo the energy efficiency gain of the last 15 years. Everything that you mentioned, demand control, ventilation, ERV, they all came about to save energy, downsize equipment, downsize fans, have cleaner air. That's one of the MERV 13 in the last 10 years. It's pretty standard that we're starting to filter use MERV 13 for the outside air. But on the return air side, MERV 13 hasn't been used. So if, for LEED, for example, to get a credit, you only have to filter your outside air with MERV 13, but we're talking about return air, and that's allowed to be MERV 8. So there are changes that are going to undo the last 15 years. So, so you're going to sacrifice occupant comfort because the equipment can't keep up on a real hot day or a real cold day, and you're going to sacrifice energy efficiency in order to be completely safe. I did want to mention the frequency of the information we're getting. When the COVID-19 first hit, I said the COVID-19, I'm not really sure how to refer to it, but when COVID-19 first hit, every hour I'd get an email that said, COVID-19 plan, COVID-19, everybody was hitting us with these COVID-19. Now every 2 hours I'm getting something from ASHRAE or one of the organizations we subscribe to about response of HVAC systems. I got one last night at 8, and one of the bullets I was going to talk about is every building is different, And the first bullet in yesterday's ASHRAE email, what's referred to as safe operation of HVAC and building water management systems, is called create a strategic plan prior to opening the building, right? And that goes along with what I was saying yesterday in our prep meeting. Every building is different. So, you know, we talk about the supply air blowing on top of Terry, I believe it was. If it's 100% outside air, that's the best scenario. If it is a fan-powered VAV box in heating mode that recycles air of that zone, that's a bad scenario if we're in heating mode. So somebody has to, building maintenance or someone has to understand the systems they have in place and what small or big steps can be taken in the most cost-efficient manner possible to reopen a building. So, you know, Brendon added the ERV bypass was referring to a wheel. Well, ERVs are also air-to-air heat exchangers that sometimes can or cannot be bypassed. So there's just a lot of complexity on what needs to be done for your particular building.
What do you see? Go ahead.
And they, you know, the other thing I do want to say is there's plenty of information out there for building operators to figure this out and move forward. It's going to take some time to actually figure it out. So go ahead.
Mike, what do you see is going to be the biggest challenge? So everyone's getting inundated with all this information. I think we agree that it's all similar, which is good, right? We agree that people aren't getting contrasting information because most of it's coming down from ASHRAE. So we're seeing consistent information. But from your standpoint, what are you seeing is going to be the biggest challenge to make pieces of this information actually work?
I think it's a coordination effort. So we do commissioning. That was something that Kat mentioned earlier. So even with brand new plans and new contractors and everybody's momentum, a new building needs a kind of TLC process to get it to work the way it's intended. So now those new buildings are 5-10 years old and they've drifted from the way they were supposed to work. And now we're understanding where they're at this current moment and then where they need to go. So that is sometimes a large communication and learning process. Okay. I think that's going to be everybody needs to be on the same page to move forward.
What do we do about retrofitting old buildings? We're talking about design moving forward. What about all the people that have buildings that are 50 years old and can't just snap their fingers and have a brand new building with all these newly designed systems?
Well, I mean, the one recommendation was to occupy your building 24 hours a day. So currently an office building has what's called scheduled hours. Well, it's really easy to go into the BAS system of a large building that I guess Terry is in right now and tell it, I don't want to shut down at 6 p.m. when people are theoretically supposed to leave. So now you're telling it, I want it to run and bring in outside air 24/7. And then we talked about the economizer mode. You know, you don't have to constantly be in economizer mode, but we can stretch the set points to maybe when it's 80 degrees out, bring in fresh air. 80 is very uncomfortable for people inside. But if you make the too bad, so sad scenario, you can increase the economizer range where you're bringing in hotter air. And there's a penalty on the humidity side, you know. So ASHRAE, believe it or not, allows your space to get up to 65% humidity. That is extremely uncomfortable to most people. We want to be around 50 or 40 to 50 is ideal. But if you read the books, ASHRAE says you can go to 65, but no commercial office tenant is going to want to be at 65% relative humidity. So if we decide to bring in more outside air, we're going to have to all understand that you're going to be uncomfortable a little bit as an occupant in a Class A space, for example.
Mike, I want to point out, since we recently revised that on 62.1, that the new requirements are when you're occupied, you have to maintain a 60-degree dew point temperature. So it's actually fixed to a hard humidity limit, although you are still allowed to drift to 65 when you're unoccupied, if I'm recalling the new requirement correctly.
But still, that's if an office building, a Class A space has humidity control, they're kind of, you know, a little lower than the 60 dew point. And and we'd have to relax that a little bit. And I just think that, you know, when it's a high paying tenant in a Class A office space, there needs to be some education. So maybe that's another, but I believe people are on board after what happened over the last 6 weeks.
Right. Kristen, you want to put this question out there that just popped up?
Yes.
Thanks.
Oops. Okay, so if you are running, is this Terry? I'm going to unmute you. Do you want to read? Here, go ahead. Wait for it.
I'm sorry for all the questions, but I have landlords like peppering me with these things 24/7 these days. So speaking of 24/7, I'm just trying to get my head around operating expenses, because if operating expenses go up, that then is passed through in a base year lease to the tenants. And I know that Catherine Pinkert is on here and is probably shaking her head and going, yeah, you're absolutely right. So I guess assuming that if you're running the HVAC 24/7 and most office buildings run probably 12 hours, then I guess logic would say that you're doubling your operating expenses for your HVAC.
I have real world data on that. I just commissioned a commercial office building, and the controls weren't ready. So they just ran it 24/7, and they needed to occupy the building. So they put occupants in there and ran it 24/7. And they said the utility bills are 2.5 times what they were before the renovation. So and also you got to remember, in the unoccupied times, that's when you have 0-degree weather outside. So your heating costs, you know, during the day, you're getting up to 30, 40, 50. At midnight, in order to bring in 0-degree outside air, it's going to be a killer in the heating mode. And that's what we're in is you know, we just got out of heating mode in the last couple of weeks. So the 2.5 times is heating mode expenditures running 24/7.
Wow. So, you just made a point, Kristen, as opposed to having the two speakers spend a lot of time with the fact sheet, putting together something, we can just send the link of this whole entire presentation, because I think it's filled with good information from start to finish, and get that out to people.
I am happy, though, to collect fact sheets from BKM and Budova to promote our crew members. So,
thank you.
all right, Kat, I think that's all we've got for now, so you can continue.
Okay. All right. Mike, what do you think, are there any solutions based on what Brendon said? Are there anything you can see that you can tell people, you're being told to do this, but here's a problem I see that's going to come up, and here's what you would suggest to fix that? Does that make sense?
I think most of the ideas that, or the 6-step plan that they talked about is a good plan. I think some of them require capital investment. I think some of them are like what they call low-hanging fruit, I guess, which is the filter changes, which is the change in occupancy hours, which is the, you know, you can easily bring in more outside air by just changing a damper position in an air handler. You know, you just sometimes don't understand fully the consequences of doing, especially bringing in more outside air. A filter, a bigger filter, a more efficient filter, decreases the amount of air you can supply to the space. And some of the fans may not be sized properly, but I think that's probably a safe thing to do, is you can change to 13 filters without much problem. But other things like bringing in more outside air, occupying your building 24/7, you really won't know the full consequences until you do it.
Is this going to put up? Go ahead.
Just be prepared for maybe higher energy bills. Be prepared for occupant discomfort.
Is this going to put a bigger burden on the facility managers, the people managing and working, knowing the systems?
Well, I mean, we already heard from Terry that the landlords are screaming already, and they haven't even made the changes yet. So I do think it is going to be somewhat of a burden. I think maybe people won't complain if they know they're safer, though.
I think landlords are still trying to figure it out. I mean, right now, it's really, everybody's still trying to get their arms around it. That's why this information that you're disseminating is something that I think a lot of landlords would like to hear. I mean, I think, you know, Catherine, you can probably jump in, and not to commandeer this conversation, but I think everybody's getting up to speed and educating themselves on what to do at this point. And but the other piece of this that came to light in hearing you, Mike, is that we're going to have tenants probably seeing, even in their current lease term, their costs going up if landlords have to implement these types of systems. And I think we need to get out ahead of this. And then you've talked a couple of times about occupant discomfort. And, you know, I think that's something we need to start addressing so we can prepare people that it's going to either be safety or discomfort, which I hadn't even thought about that until you brought it up.
So,
And Terry,
I want to
Terry, I think you
clarify.
make.
I just want to
chiming in there.
I just want to clarify about the occupant discomfort. One of the recommendations of ASHRAE that we did not choose to emphasize at BKM is the need to maintain temperature and humidity applicable specific to the infectious agent that you're trying to control. There are a wide range of conditions, and those of you who are familiar with ASHRAE 55 understand the analysis that one can go through to determine what is a comfortable range. And really the goal of these recommendations is not to create an uncomfortable environment. It's using very simple terms to tell you to expand. So the suggestion of 24/7 is if you can, do 24/7. But if you can't, extend it an hour on each end of your day, extend it 2 hours on each end of your day so that you can still get some of the benefits. It's not trying to remake the whole system. Increasing the outdoor air ventilation should not be done at the expense of occupant comfort, because that's also a goal of ASHRAE. The problem is that unless you get an engineering analysis done, or you have a really good building tech, because there are lots of rules of thumb out there, and there are really good building technicians that will know what their systems are capable of and can feel it out. That's one way that you could potentially start to implement these changes. At the end of the day, a lot of jurisdictions are probably going to want you to have an engineering analysis done, particularly if you start changing ventilation rates, because that's something that's in the code. But in terms of filter changes, as long as you're meeting the minimum requirements, if you increase outside air, very few people are going to look at you sideways and say, oh, you need to come back to us for a permit for that. But again, your mileage may vary by jurisdiction. But these are things that ASHRAE is saying you can do this right away in a way that's going to improve the quality of the air in the building and help. But one thing that you have to understand is all of this is premised on the fact that you're going to follow CDC recommendations, which include more frequent cleaning of surfaces, elimination of common food areas. So we can't have these kitchenettes anymore. People can't bring food in from home and share it with everyone in the office. It's just not conducive to controlling the spread of infectious diseases. So there are other technologies that you can implement as well. So we already have occupancy or vacancy sensors for our lights. You can do contactless door openers. That's something that for a small investment in your building is probably going to have a more meaningful impact than any modification you make to the HVAC system. So I know the topic today is HVAC, but we need to remember that right now, the best science we have is telling us that more often than not, these diseases are spread by contact. So anything that you can do to reduce contact with potentially contaminated surfaces or individuals is going to have the biggest payoff in terms of reducing the spread of infection.
Great. Mike, Kristen just submitted a really good question. Does this cut the life cycle of the system in half if they're running 24/7? Like how is that going to impact the kind of life cycle of the system?
Not in half. It might decrease it a little bit, but start and stop is rough on equipment as well. So, it may be a wash, but equipment does have run hours that it's only rated for. So on the surface, I would think, yes, it would degrade the equipment life, maybe not by half, but yeah, maybe. That's a tough question. It's certainly not half, but it's not full life expectancy.
Okay, thanks. Brendon, Abby just asked, can you go back and talk a little bit more about the kitchen and kitchenette, which is something she's saying most tenants want. So Abby, I don't know if you want to unmute and talk about that yourself. And
were you saying that going forward, that is something that landlords shouldn't do? What do we do about tenants that already have them in their spaces? I just needed to know a little bit more about what you were saying.
So in our office, one of the first steps we did is we banned the sharing of food in the kitchenette. And one of the second things we did is we said that people could no longer bring shared food into the office. And right now, this is based on CDC recommendations. So we're following the recommendations, and they may decide to lift these during the pandemic because let's be frank, people are social creatures, and one of the oldest social traditions that we're aware of is sharing a meal. So the idea that we are going to forever ban the sharing of meals seems to me a bit outlandish, but that's just my personal opinion. I think we'll eventually get back to a point where having a catering space or a kitchen space will be acceptable. There will probably be changes in the way we do it, but right now, the idea is that we shouldn't be having these spaces, at least during the current situation, and there will have to be a frank reassessment of how we can share food safely in a public environment going forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Catherine, did you want to pipe in? We kind of missed your comment to that you were putting on Terry's.
Sure, no problem. I think I totally agree with Terry. I think she makes a great point. Again, the reason we all do this is because these are investment assets, right? Whether it's publicly traded or a private client or whatever, there are tenants renting space from a landlord to make money. And Terry's absolutely right. If 2020 or 2021 becomes a tenant's base year for a long-term lease, then we're implementing all these changes. We're hiring engineers to do studies. We're adding new filters. I got the HVAC guys coming in there. We're running buildings a lot longer hours. Hopefully, assuming we find a vaccine and we figure out, better ways to manage pandemics, you hope to go back to a level of more normal operations going forward. And then you've got this whole class of tenants that's stuck with a really high base year of operating expenses. And so that means that for my landlords, I'm not recouping any share of OpEx for a decade. And so how does that factor into leasing? I mean, I think all of these things, it's like dominoes that fall. And I'm always thinking of the economics of all of this. And I just keep hearing dollar signs, all these things. We want to keep people safe, but that's expensive. And what are the consequences of that?
And as tenant reps, you better try to get some caps in place, because if this continues to escalate these expenses, it's going to become, a cost issue for a tenant to occupy any building, and they're not going to be able to budget for that expense, because it sounds like it's going to be an ongoing kind of revolving door of how to keep up with all the CDC rules.
But it is on a case-by-case basis. I did paint it as doom and gloom, but there may be some buildings out there that, with a 2-hour before and a 2-hour after, we don't have to occupy them 24/7. So some of the buildings out there may be okay, and that's what I was trying to say, is everything just has to be looked at and negotiated on a path forward. So I just don't want to say it's always going to be 2.5 times more expensive to operate a building, and it's not always going to be that the occupants are uncomfortable. And if we keep having mild winters and hot summers, they may only be uncomfortable in the summertime, but it is a case-by-case basis, like Brandon said.
All right, so let me ask you guys, and I don't know if this is an easy question, but if you were to tell these people here today, looking at you, you know, as experts for advice, what would be the top 3 things they should do, or tell the property manager to do, or the person in charge of the building? What would you tell them? Maybe even just say the number 1 thing, or if you can give me 1, 2, and 3. You know, what's kind of the first 3 things on their plan should be what?
Do you want to go first, Brendon? I'm writing mine down.
Oh, I was going to offer it. All right. Well, I can think of 2 right off the bat, and hopefully by the time I'm done with those, I will get to the 3rd one.
Choose, okay.
My number 1 piece of advice would be contactless technology. We already have wave operators for doors. We already have a lot of sensorless light switches. I think that should be our number 1 priority right now. If you're going to invest your money, add contactless operators, make it so a person can go into and out of your building without touching a surface if that's all they need to do. The number 2 thing I would recommend would be the increasing the filtration. And the reason why is because it's simple enough to do. There is a cost increase for the filters compared to a standard MERV 8 filter. But if you can get your hands on the MERV 13 filter, you're not doing any harm, and you're having the minimal amount of impact on your energy. If your system is newer, chances are the fan has some type of speed control, and it will be adaptive enough to overcome the pressure losses associated with a higher filter. If it's an older system, then you might need to get a balancing agent in there, but they can probably change a pulley size in order to get you where you need to go.
Right.
And then if I wanted to choose number 3, I would say extend the ventilation of your system in whatever way you can. And I'm not going to pigeonhole that into either longer operating hours or higher outside air. I think that's something you need to look at with the capabilities of your system and figure out how you can get more fresh air into the building. And the only reason why that is number 3 is because it does have an energy impact. It's going to hurt your operating expenses. But that's truly going to be the most effective if health is your priority. Is the more fresh air you can get into the building, the better you can reduce your risks.
Thanks, Brendon. Mike?
My 3 were a little more high level than that. I do agree with the filters. I think I hinted that earlier, but understand the recommendations. You bring up a good point. If we're all focused on HVAC, but the contact the recommendations are more important, then maybe we take a dial back the HVAC recommendations. So understand the recommendations, understand your building and what it's capable of, not only from an HVAC, but from some of these door operators and whatnot. And then you just really need to take the top 2 of understanding the recommendations, understand your building, and just take a stab at your best stab at a plan to move forward. We're going to do this, this, and this. And if that's not enough, we're going to investigate it a month from now and do this, this, and this. So it's high level.
Okay. I think we're just almost done, but go ahead, Brendon.
I was going to say, Mike makes a great point, because that's the way healthcares and laboratories have always done it. They have risk infection or risk consultants and risk managers, and they go through an iterative process. When something goes wrong, they pause, they ask, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? And what can we do to make it better next time? And I think that the commercial world would benefit a lot from starting to implement that type of mindset going forward. So thank you, Mike, for emphasizing that point. I think it's a very good one.
All right, Karen, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
I think that Brendon and Mike addressed it, but it just sounds like a moving target, because without some sort of official guidance that employers can point to as their due diligence, then they're still open for potential lawsuits should an employee get infected. So who would be putting out that guidance? I mean, would it be ASHRAE? Would it be CDC? Who would be putting that out?
ASHRAE published a notice on May 7th about reopening, and their number one point is to create a strategic plan prior to opening a building. So I know it's not much better guidance than you got from us, but it is the same recommendation. It really needs to be there. Some other items on the list, you need to make sure that PPE requirements are being followed if those requirements are still in place from the CDC. They recommend 2-hour flushing before and post occupancy, so not the 24/7, but that extra 2 hours that I mentioned. Ensure that the custodial staff is familiar with the latest EPA and CDC guidelines. Keep the systems running on minimum outside air when the building is unoccupied instead of full shut off. And run your garage exhaust for 2 hours pre-occupancy with their requirements. And that's available on ASHRAE's webpage under news. If you just search for ASHRAE reopening in Google, you'll get a link to that article.
So Karen, I'm just speaking to my experience. So when I only commission a building every so often, but so if one of my developers that's a good client of mine called up and said, what can we do? I know that building well enough to say, here's what I would do in a short period of time as a turnaround to help them with the plan. And same thing, I do work on vivarium, animal research labs. I know the systems enough that I would be able to turn something around quickly. So most buildings have somebody that knows the building and understands it well enough that if you gave them some guidance of here's the recommendation, building champion is there's always seems to be one building champion per building. If you gave them the recommendations, they could say, we could do this, this, and this easily, and I don't think it would affect our tenants. You just need to kind of figure out who that person is. And they may already be looking at stuff like this. Like Brendon said, some of these the managers are very in tune with what's going on. Just trust them and put some responsibility on them to take a stab and keep feeding them information on the new recommendations and where you could be. So those folks are out there and they know this stuff. You just have to find them.
Good. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Brendon. Thank you, Mike. And thank you all for joining us today. I'll throw it back to Kristen to round us out and bring us home.
Yes, great. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much, Mike, Kat, and Brendon. We will, again, this will be posted to YouTube. Kelsey will be sending out the link as soon as the video is processed and uploaded. And then as we get the fact sheets from BKM and Budova, Kelsey can send those out to the participants. Next week, I believe, is the 19th. We're going to be talking about emerging trends. So we're going to talk a lot about the kitchenettes and the common areas, the touchless, the contactless office. I know Harkins is pricing that out now for our office. So we look forward to seeing you next week, Tuesday at 9:30. Thank you.
Thanks,